alone plenuth aguron iter peludrin golani auen Tyrannus Owen Brigid Carnunos. Before me, the vultures of the sky and the powers of air in the east. And behind me, the baths of wisdom and the powers of water in the west. And on my right, the white stag and the powers of fire in the south. And on my left, the great bear and the powers of earth in the north. For around me glow the pentagrams, and within me shine the three rays of light. Greetings and welcome back to the Sacred Grove. If you've been following along with my recent videos, you'll see the continuing changes of fall all around me. You can see why pre-Christian Europe recognized this time of year as a time of death, as many of the plants around us are dying or becoming dormant, for the cold season is coming here in the northern hemisphere. Though it has remained unseasonably warm lately, it's cooling off now, and the sense of winter's approach is getting stronger. I'm recording this just a few days before Samhain, or Calangafe, one of the 4 festivals in the neopagan wheel of the year, positioned between the 4 main solar observations. Samhain is a liminal or threshold festival, when the veil between the material and the spiritual worlds is thinnest. This allows us to interact more easily with the spirits of the other world, as well as the souls of deceased ancestors. There is evidence that the ancient Celts opened burial mounds at this time of year, as they were portals to the other world. Certainly it's evident that some Neolithic passage tombs are oriented to the sunrise at the time of Samhain. The Druids likely recognized the impact of confronting the inevitability of death brought on by the change of season, and helped people cope through various local customs and rituals, including gatherings, feasts, bonfires, and sacrificial offerings to appease the spiritual powers to get the people and livestock through the harsh winters. As for me, your Crafty Druid, while I will share news of death this week, I will also offer reason for hope. So have courage. In the spirit of Samhain, we'll laugh at death and find ways to take action. Each week as we explore being on Earth, we'll check in with current events in the wild world and in the tamed world. You know, news can be scary and depressing, but climate change is happening, and for me, I find it's best to know what's going on, to be able to react to it and find ways to cope with it. So each week, I'll share news items from the tamed world that have floated to the top in my attention, and I'll read some highlights from each article. This week, I'm focusing on just 3 news stories. But if you're getting used to the large amount of news commentary I shared last week and the week before, don't worry. There is lots to discuss based on these 3 stories. They all cover the recent release of significant data and recommendations by large groups of scientists whose work comprises global levels of monitoring and analysis of the detrimental impact humans are having on the planet's life support systems. The first story covers the publication of a report that is so dire it challenges us to maintain our hope and courage, but it's vitally important information that can't be ignored. The second story also relates to a daunting report as well, as it analyzes the increasing global risks of disasters in 6 main categories. However, it's also an effective counterpart since it offers specific ways in which action can be taken. As the authors of that report state on their website, luckily, we are able to see the danger ahead of us. Changing our behaviors and priorities can shape a path towards a bright, sustainable, and equitable future. That's music to my ears, since my mission for this channel, to explore being on Earth, is meant to help us do just that. See the danger ahead of us, in part by sharing these kinds of scary but informative reports. The third story is aimed at a theme that is near and dear to my heart and closely relates to the mission of this channel, my animistic Druidry belief system, and the Gaia principle I described in the last video. This story covers not a report, but an editorial. This editorial has been published simultaneously by multiple medical journals, essentially representing the entire world's scientific medical research community. So, the first report was covered by many news articles, including this one from I Fucking Love Science, written by Tom Hale. Tom writes that the 2023 State of the Climate Report is an update to a periodic report that was last released in 2019. That report has been co-signed by more than 15,000 scientists in 161 countries. The current report, published in the journal Bioscience, is a dashboard that tracks climate change using 35 planetary vital signs. Things have gotten much worse since 2019. This year, 20 of the 35 key indicators are at record extremes. The vital signs include metrics such as carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, tree loss due to wildfires, sea level change, Antarctic ice mass, the number of extremely hot days, ocean acidity, and more. In a press release, William Ripple, one of the lead authors of the report, and a distinguished professor in the Oregon State University College of Forestry, shared his frank assessment of the overall picture painted by the 35 vital signs. Life on our planet is clearly under siege, Ripple said. The statistical trends show deeply alarming patterns of climate-related variables and disasters. We also found little progress to report as far as humanity combating climate change. The report itself is published on the Bioscience website, and you can download the complete report as a PDF file too. I put the links in the description. Just a few highlights show how serious the scientists are at urging decision makers and all of us to understand how dangerous a situation we are all in, that we must all take action immediately. The second story was also covered quite widely, as in this article Jake Johnson published on the Common Dreams website. The story covers a report released by the United Nations University's Institute for Environment and Human Security. This report is focused on 6 risk tipping points caused by human activity, primarily burning fossil fuels, but more broadly rooted in the range of activities which make up the fossil fuel economy. The report provides this definition of risk tipping points. A risk tipping point is the moment at which a given socio-ecological system is no longer able to buffer risks and provide its expected functions, after which the risk of catastrophic impacts to these systems increases substantially. The report analyzes current activities and conditions and assesses the current level of risk. As part of the summary of that assessment, the report states that today we are moving perilously close to the brink of multiple risk tipping points. Human actions are behind this rapid and fundamental change to the planet. we are introducing new risks and amplifying existing ones by indiscriminately extracting our water resources, damaging nature and biodiversity, polluting both Earth and space, and destroying our tools and options to deal with disaster risk. As I mentioned earlier, the report does provide advice on action. Using a two-dimensional matrix, potential actions are characterized as avoid-adapt solutions using delay-transform strategies. So, an example of a solution to adapt to climate change using a delay strategy could be increased use of air conditioners. Conversely, halting greenhouse gas emissions and leading social change towards a low-carbon lifestyle represents an avoid-transform approach. Generally, avoid-transform approaches are much more difficult, but much more beneficial. In any case, opening the door to take action is helpful to maintain hope and courage for the future. As with the first story, I've put a direct link to this report in the description as well. In the third story, reported by Lauren Pelly in CBC News, over 200 medical journals from around the world simultaneously published an editorial calling on the World Health Organization to declare a global health emergency. The same group had previously published a similar editorial in 2021. That one titled, "Call for Emergency Action to Limit Global Temperature Increases, Restore Biodiversity, and Protect Health." That was also based on unequivocal scientific evidence that a global increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average and the continued loss of biodiversity risk catastrophic harm to health that will be impossible to reverse. In this follow-up, the conditions of climate change have worsened, and the alarm level of the editorial, which links the worsening states of planetary and human health, has risen to match. The title and subtitle make the case for immediate action strongly, saying that it is time to treat the climate and nature crisis as one indivisible global health emergency, and joint action is essential for planetary and human health. The editorial further describes how the current responses to the climate change crisis and the biodiversity loss nature crisis are separate, when actually they can only be successfully addressed as one indivisible crisis. The research communities who provided evidence on the two crises for COP28 on climate and COP16 on biodiversity are largely separate. However, after many of the members were together for a workshop in 2020, their concluding remarks stated that only by considering climate and biodiversity as parts of the same complex problem can solutions be developed that avoid maladaptation and maximize the beneficial outcomes. Finally, the editorial represents a form of action, not just analysis itself, and it further requests that the world's highest medical authority, the World Health Organization, exercise its decision-making capacity and take action to address the climate and nature crisis. On the basis of the greatly increasing risk of reaching dangerous climate tipping points, combined with the severe impacts on health already occurring, the editorial calls for the World Health Organization to declare the indivisible climate and nature crisis as a global health emergency. So, while these are ominous reports, it is important to face the facts to best know what to do and how to do it. And since action is being taken and some good decisions being made with calls for more, these three big stories offer reason to hope that there is spreading determination to divert humanity from the worst behavior and outcomes. As I've said before, a key part of the Druid mindset is seeing connections. Even when hard to see, connections are everywhere. But for many decision makers, ignoring or concealing connections are more powerful and profitable strategies. For example, hiding the connection between greenhouse gas emissions and the climate and nature crisis has enabled fossil fuel companies to make billions of dollars in profits. while strategic for the fossil fuel economy as a whole, denying the connections between destructive activities, businesses, and decisions has become a basic foundation of the Western way of life. People have been led by corporate and political leaders to ignore the harm and death caused by this way of life. Bleaching corals, disappearing flying insects, declining songbird and salmon populations, the list is long and growing. While death is obviously a natural part of the cycle of life, causing more death more quickly to more vulnerable beings is pushing the planetary organism out of balance. As a result, in a more deeply sinister way, being led to ignore this dynamic of death has resulted in a generalized refusal to accept death. We are led by technostatists who now dream of cyber immortality by uploading themselves into the Matrix to freeze their isolated, meaningless lives into a cold silicon hell forever. This is an approach that statist kings and tyrants have been using since the earliest days of ancient monument building. Just as pharaohs of old siphoned off enormous proportions of the productive capacity of their people for generations to create their immortality timeships, the pyramids, so the technostatists of our time are amassing billions to build AI and VR architecture while the cost of food rises out of reach for many of us. The way out of this death denial trap is to break the hold of materialist, consumerist, fossil fuel culture that tells us we can cheat death indefinitely if we just buy the right things. Instead, we need to restore a healthy acceptance of death as part of the natural cycle of life. Westerners living their day-to-day lives mainly in urban environments constructed of glass, steel, and concrete have very little contact with death in any way, since they have little contact with life. In other words, when we are detached from life, we are detached from death as well. Having a healthy relationship with the life around us gives us a better relationship with death. Simply observing the seasonal cycle, as we do at Samhain, and Imbolc, Beltane, and Lunasa, shows that there is always renewal. Once we stop buying the false immortality promises of the fossil fuel economy, we can reduce the amount of greenhouse gas, plastic, and other forms of pollution we emit, and stop killing so many of our vulnerable fellow beings. Ironically, by accepting death, we will end up having less of it. The mission of this channel is to explore being on Earth. Part of that exploration is to bridge across various fields of study. From a druid's perspective, the Earth is a single being. Where others see divisions, druids see connections. All creatures, including humans, are connected, as are all human activities, including creativity in the arts. So, let's take a look and a listen to some great work by the awesome musicians and artists that connects to this week's theme. The photo this week is a seasonal mandala I made as part of my observation of Samhain. Featuring some of the brilliant colors of the native plants of the Frontenac Arch, I created a design based on the classic pentagram, which symbolizes the elements, among other things. In keeping with the theme of death, many of the pieces of the design demonstrate death and dormancy, including the brightly colored deciduous leaves and the bird skull at the center. Which brings us to the song of the week. When it comes to songs about death, there are a huge number of choices. After love, death may be the second most explored theme in popular music. Whether musicians are considering their own mortality, thumbing their nose at death, or expressing grief over actual losses, death is a rich source of inspiration. So, no surprise that we won't limit ourselves to a single song this week. As there were 3 news stories, so there will also be 3 songs to explore this week. All of them are by artists who were inspired, at least in large part, by experiences of loss and grief themselves. First, there is Gone Again, the title track of Patti Smith's 1996 album. It had been 8 years since her previous album. During the interval, Smith experienced several tragic losses. Among the musical colleagues she lost were Kurt Cobain and Jerry Garcia. More closely, she had lost her brother Todd, but the most painful losses were close friend and lifelong collaborator Robert Mapplethorpe and her husband, Fred Sonic Smith. Smith had actually contributed to the writing of this explosive song, Gone Again, before he passed. Like the album of the same name, the song addresses the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, and is a deeply personal expression of prolonged grief. Second, in 2019's Ghosteen, Nick Cave works through the stages of grief following the tragic death of his teenage son Arthur in 2015. Reflecting the typical emotional stages of mourning, the album covers themes of death related to faith, friendship, love, and madness, among others. While Cave had released a previous album, Skeleton Tree, a year after Arthur's death, Ghosteen was the first complete album Cave had conceived, written, recorded, and released since the terrible loss, and it is imbued with the intense feelings that had Cave describing himself as a man mad with grief at the time. Part of the madness he expresses in Waiting for You is in denial of the finality of death, desperately trying to believe that if Christianity can be based on belief in resurrection, then Cave as a father can believe in the same hope for his son. Finally, when it comes to songs about death and grief, it may be that this song is the bleakest and most powerfully sad of all. Interestingly, Tom York has said, related to the enduring popularity of this song, despite its bleak intensity, that he suspects many of Radiohead's fans simply don't realize how deeply painful it is. York has said of the song that it is the dark tunnel without the light at the end. It represents all tragic emotion that is so hurtful that the sound of that melody is its only definition. It's why we play it towards the end of our sets. It drains me, and it shakes me, and hurts like hell every time I play it. Looking out at thousands of people cheering and smiling, oblivious to the tragedy of its meaning. Like when you're going to have your dog put down and it's wagging its tail on the way there. That's what they all look like, and it breaks my heart. In this case, the losses experienced by York and Radiohead were not specific people, but rather, as described by Jazz Monroe writing in the NME, reflect their contemplations of the declining environment, the international victims of Western excess, and the collapse of mainstream spirituality. Themes that resonate strongly with me and my work in exploring being on Earth, especially this week during the time of Samhain. And now for the t-shirt of the week. During the intro, you may have noticed the shirt I was wearing. That design is called As Above, So Below, and is by the amazing alchemy and occult clothing shop, Credo Quia Absurdum. I have several of their shirts, and they're always coming out with new designs. On their website, they show current designs for sale and also maintain an archive of older designs that are no longer for sale. They also highlight upcoming designs that you can keep on your watch list. They do have some other items for sale, including tote bags, and they have a death tote bag, but it's currently out of stock. One great design is this week's t-shirt of the week, and it's called Thanatos Schism. As with most of their designs, a great explanation of the meaning is provided on the website. In this case, they explain that this design represents the Greek personification of death, the god responsible for guiding the dead to the underworld. They also explain that during the 14th century in Europe, when the world faced its worst pandemic, he came to be known as the Grim Reaper. There are only a few of this t-shirt left, so please check the link in the description and visit their online shop for this and other great t-shirt designs. Now it's time for the tarot card of the week. This week, the tarot card comes from one of my top 3 decks of all time, the Tabula Mundi. This deck was created by Mel Moline, an occultist and Thalamite from Western Massachusetts, a place that is home to so many seekers. I first heard about Ms. Moline and this amazing deck back in 2017. At that time, Ms. Moline and her esoteric colleague T. Susan Chang were collaborating on a podcast called Fortune's Wheelhouse. I was an avid fan, listening excitedly to each new episode as they were published. I became a Patreon and subsequently was lucky enough to be able to purchase the Tabula Mundi Coloris Arcus edition. I also managed to acquire more of Mel Moline's amazing creations, but that is a story for another time. From the Tabula Mundi, this week's card is, suitably, Major Arcana number 13, Death. You can see that Ms. Moline has rendered this design with Egyptian iconography. The Egyptians had powerful beliefs about death, beliefs that drove their behavior in many ways. In this design, as Ms. Moline describes in the deck's little white book, rather than riding a pale horse, death is shown as Osiris, the god of the underworld, and depicted riding a composite creature comprising 3 aspects of Scorpio: the scorpion, the serpent, and the eagle, which also represent the 3 stages of putrefaction. The Hebrew letter that corresponds to this card is Nun, which means fish, and is shown as a salmon, since its spawning represents the cycle of life and death, as we explored in last week's video. The pyramids in the background and the figure pointing out the pole star both symbolize immortality, as the pyramids are tombs that are not tombs, as they house the pharaoh in the afterlife, and the pole star never leaves the sky. Ms. Moline writes further about the interpretation of this card that life and death are each an illusion, each a part of the snake renewing itself. Shed your skin. Transform. The process of transformation is the core of the cycle of life and death. Though we mourn the people and things we care about when they pass, they have been transformed into our memories and live on. In the hands of artists, these memories form the basis of moving works of art. For Patti Smith and Nick Cave, the albums they created are tributes to precious loved ones who then live on in the ears and minds of generations of listeners. In the case of Radiohead's Street Spirit, we are invited into the intense pain and mourning brought about by the contemplation of declining environment, the international victims of Western excess, and the collapse of mainstream spirituality. In this way, listening, exploring, and appreciating this powerful music, we also explore and discover that if we can confront the intensity of this song, we can confront the losses that inspired it and that we are facing in being on Earth. Within that confrontation, if we bring hope and courage, we can transform the fear and sorrow of death into the transformation of the fossil fuel economy itself and the creation of a better way of life on Earth, in balance with Gaia, our living planetary home. My alone planeth aguron iter peludren golani